Buonasera a tutti. Good afternoon and welcome to the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome. My name is Laura Overpelt and I am the Director of Studies in Art History here at this institute. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture, The Past as Stepping Stone for the Future, EU Heritage and Memory Policies by Professor Aline Sierp, both present here in the room and online with us via Zoom. Before I will properly introduce today's speaker and her lecture, for those of you who are not familiar with our institute, I would like to share a few words about our history and our mission and the context in which this lecture takes place. Founded in 1904 with the scope to be able to do research about the Dutch, their history and art in Italy, in the recently opened Vatican archives, the KNIR is now the largest and oldest of the Dutch scientific institutes abroad. We serve as an important bridge between Dutch and Italian academics and the extensive international academic community present in Rome. We aim to support cutting-edge research projects carried out by early career and senior scholars affiliated to our 6 Dutch partner universities. After World War II, the KNIR played an important role in the re-establishment of the scientific and cultural ties between the Netherlands and Italy. Since 1933, we have been located in this building at the border of the Villa Borghese Park in the so-called Valle Giulia, where various international institutes are brought together, literally and spiritually. Since the early 1990s, the Netherlands Institute has focused primarily on the academic world, attracting a growing number of students and scholars in the humanities. However, our focus is ever more interdisciplinary, looking beyond our traditional fields of research, history, art history, and archaeology, and beyond the borders of Rome, Italy, and the Mediterranean, with a research focus that can be summarized as Rome in the world and the world in Rome. Today's lecture is a keynote to kick off the KNIR Colloquium, The Making and Unmaking of Heritage between Contestation, Collaboration, and Reappropriation, organized by Dr. Mayada Matbouli and Sinead Barnabas, both assistant professors at Groningen University. KNIR Colloquia are exclusive, small-scale expert meetings facilitated and funded by the KNIR, organized by one or a small team of university lecturers affiliated at one of our 6 partner universities in the Netherlands. They are especially intended to offer early and mid-career academics from all research fields the opportunity to improve their research profile and boost their own research by organizing an international workshop on a topic central to their current research agenda, which is directly or indirectly linked to the KNIRs and/or Rome. The participants of the colloquium by Drs. Matbouli and Barnabas will revisit the concept of heritage and examine the processes of its making and unmaking, sparked by the ongoing protest actions against statues and monuments, such as those associated with the hashtags Rhodes Must Fall, Take It Down, and Black Lives Matter, as well as movements for restitution and indigenous rights around the world, which highlight the continued need for scholarship on the topic of heritage and its various constructions. According to them, heritage making includes producing heritage narratives, labeling, cataloging, and decisions over what to remember. The unmaking of heritage they see in 2 ways. First, as the deliberate process of producing counter-arguments against authorized heritage discourses, and second, as the process of ignoring, overlooking, and dismissing communities' heritage in favor of authorized discourses. These are entangled processes, the exploration of which will allow for in-depth investigation into the complex dynamics of contestation, collaboration, and reappropriation of heritage, topics that are central to current discussions. The colloquium aims to examine the roles played by multiple actors in the making and unmaking of heritage, explore the storytelling of material heritage, and critically analyze archives and collections as not merely methodological, but rather ontological tools of heritage making and unmaking. The participants will discuss their ongoing research, which will result in a special issue of the International Journal of Heritage Studies, co-edited by Barnabas and Mabouli. Over to today's speaker and the subject of her lecture. Dr. Aline Sierp is Associate Professor in European History and Memory Studies and current head of the Department of the History Department at Maastricht University. She is the co-founder and co-president of the Memory Studies Association and the Council of European Studies Research Network on Transnational Memory and Identity in Europe. She is also co-editor of the Berghaan book series Worlds of Memory. Aline Sierp holds a PhD in Comparative European Politics and History, summa cum laude, from the University of Siena. Her MA in European History, Politics, Policy and Society with distinction was jointly awarded by the University of Bath, Sciences Po Paris, and the University of Siena. Before joining Maastricht University, she worked as researcher at the Dachau concentration camp memorial site in Germany, where she was responsible for human rights education in the International Office. During her studies, she completed traineeships at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, the United Nations in Turin, and the German Embassy in Rome. Professor Sierp's research interests cover collective memory after experiences of human rights violations, questions of identity, and European integration. She has published widely on memory and identity issues and is the author of History, Memory, and Trans-European Identity, Unifying Divisions, published with Routledge 2014 and a paperback edition of 2017. And she's co-editor with Christian Karner of Dividing United Europe from Crisis to Fragmentation, published with Routledge in 2019, and of Agency in Transnational Memory Politics with Berghaan in 2020, together with Jenny Wüstenberg. Aline Sierp held visiting fellowships at the CSIC in Madrid, the EUY in Florence, and Lewis Business University here in Rome. And she guest lectures at many institutes around the globe, from New York to Melbourne. In today's lecture, Professor Sierp will trace the development of the increasing involvement of the European Union in heritage and memory politics, starting with the development of a felt need for the European founding myth and ending with the EU's active formulation of policies dealing with heritage and memory issues. She will highlight the role the memory of the Holocaust played in creating a shared consciousness and the difficulties EU factors faced when trying to enter an area that until then had been considered an exclusive prerogative of the nation-state. In particular, she will focus on the disputes between East and Western European countries regarding memories and discuss how the EU deals with those conflictual questions. In analyzing initiatives of the EU aimed at creating common ground for debates on history, heritage, and memory, she furthermore highlights the blank spots in the development of shared European consciousness of the past. After her lecture, the first questions will be moderated by the organizer of the colloquium, Dr. Barnabas and Mabouli, with the purpose to broaden the perspective transgressing the European borders from each of their own research perspectives. After that, the floor will be opened to questions from all of you here in the audience and on Zoom online. And for those who are on Zoom, can either type their questions in the chat box or raise their hand so we can open the microphone and you can ask the question verbally. So now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Aline Sierp.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. I'll keep a bit an eye on my phone. So that's the only reason why I have the phone here, to make sure that I'm not speaking too long and we have enough time for questions. I was initially asked to give some sort of introduction to heritage studies, to heritage policies. And when I thought about the lecture, and I also knew that there was a workshop attached to it, of course, and I saw the topic of the workshop, I thought, okay, what would be the most useful really here? And I think a good keynote lecture is a lecture that frames the following days to a certain extent. That allows you to connect to it later, to maybe find entry points for your own research, to raise questions that we can discuss maybe also in the next days, to see how your research relates to this. So what I decided to do is to indeed paint a very big picture to a certain extent. So to go over quite a number of years in policymaking in the European Union, and to obviously stay a little bit on the surface because of that, because I have to cover so much ground, hoping though that that allows you then to enter at different points. Having said that, it doesn't mean that I have to talk the whole time. When there's something that either you want to know a bit more about or that we should discuss a bit more in depth, then you're also welcome to just stop me, and I can go more into depth then and there. As you can see from the title, this is about heritage and memory policies. Why heritage and memory? The two of them are obviously very closely related. Just earlier, one of you was saying, I feel a bit like a fish out of water here. We are all dealing with different elements of heritage. What actually is heritage? But I think that is a nice that's a nice part of this topic to a certain extent, that it's multifaceted. There's many different elements to heritage. There's many different ways of discussing this as well. And one of the elements is memory, of course. It's the interpretation of the past. And what I will do in the next 45 minutes or so is highlight how the two are connected and to what extent heritage policies or memory policies grew out of each other, because there's a very clear relationship between them. Here. Looking at the different keyboard. Memories, especially of World War II, played a very important role in the establishment of many international organizations. This idea of preventing another war, of having a negative experience that should not be repeated, is a red thread that is running through most thinking of the organizations that were established in the wake of World War II. Just think about the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the OEC, the Council of Europe, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and then last but not least, the European Coal and Steel Community. We all know that the European Union, as it's called today, was a bit of a peace project. However, not only. If you've studied European integration history, you know that it was not just a peace project. There were very hard economic and political interests at stake that pushed France to propose what today is the European Union. Nevertheless, the memories of the first decades of the 20th century, and that means not only World War II, but also World War I, were elements that were ever present in the early years of European integration, and they became the European Union founding myth. It was especially the determination to avoid another war that, since the Schuman Declaration on the 9th of May 1950, became central to the master narrative of the European Union. And this master narrative is still very present. I think most people associate peace with the European Union, and they're not necessarily thinking of the other interests that were at stake in the early years. This narrative was also pushed forward very much by the institutions at the time. It was evoked in official documents. Most political speeches make references to this experience of war that should not be repeated. And it markedly influenced the setup of the Union's institutions as well. The way the EU was conceptualized had to do very much with this avoidance of another war between the different member states. If you keep this in mind, how important this was as a founding myth, as a narrative in the initial years, then it's almost a bit surprising that EU activism in this field remained exclusively on the level of symbolic politics. In the beginning, there were no policies that dealt with this. There was no memory policies or heritage policies or any policies that officially dealt with the symbolic element of European integration. There was no active attempt really to devise identity policies neither, right? There was a lot of talk about identity and how important this was, but there was no policies behind this. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind that EU competencies were also very limited at the time. The EU at the time was more of a free trade area, which focused very much on economic cooperation, and competences remained very limited. They still are very limited. We always have to keep that in mind when there's also complaints about the EU not doing enough. Very often the EU cannot do more simply because it's the member states who still have the power. This changed in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had the oil crisis, a really harsh economic crisis, which led to a loss of confidence in the European integration project. It was the moment that probably policymakers understood that one could not fall in love with a market. That was Jacques Delors famously who stated this, saying, well, what does us actually tie to the European Union? If this is just a market, a common market, then I'm not surprised that citizens don't really feel any attachment to it. And this was probably then the reason for policymakers to feel the need that there needs to be something else. There must be a raison d'être that goes beyond economic growth, something that can tie European citizens to these institutions, which obviously remained very abstract for many. It's like a political entity that they don't felt any relation to. And this was the moment when culture and cultural policies acquired a new meaning as the glue that could potentially hold Europeans together in times of crisis. So it was the fallback option, if you so want. If it's not the politics as such, if it's not the economy that keeps people together, then maybe it is culture and cultural policies that could provide this this road. In the beginning, the first attempts to come up with some sort of a European story of European heritage was to refer back to the European past and other moments of integration, markedly Charlemagne as the father of Europe, or the myth of Europa. You probably have seen pictures of Europa sitting on a white bull. If you go to the House of European History in Brussels, I don't know if any of you have been there. No, I see. The first picture that I showed you here, that is from the House of European History. It's one of the big, sculptures that they have there. It's called the Vortex of History. If you enter this museum, then this is one of the first things you see, a big picture of Europa on the white bull, which I think in itself is very telling. In the 1970s, also the history of European integration itself became the focus of commemoration. Some sort of teleological narrative was created, which is very much still present in today's EU. Again, if you, for example, go to the Parlamentarium, which is on the opposite or on the other side of the European Parliament in Brussels, it's another museum. You very much see this narrative, right? A very heroic narrative of the European Union rising out of the ashes of World War II. But none of those proved to be very successful with European citizens. In the 1980s, then, efforts were concentrated on activities that were promoting actively a common European heritage, which was going beyond these very abstract narratives of Charlemagne and the myth of Europa, but rather focused on European achievements. And the European Capitals of Culture program, which was born in 1985, is probably the program that incarnates more than any other program this idea of a common European memory and identity, which goes beyond abstract political principles. Now you can guess which were the two first capitals of culture that were chosen. If you think about European heritage, you're all heritage experts, so maybe you can come up with an educated guess. Rome, yeah, that could be. It was an Italian city, but it was not Rome. Florence, yeah, exactly. Renaissance. And the second one, what do you think? That could have been, yeah. go further back in time. Athens, exactly. Yeah. Cradle of democracy. So that tells you, I think only by giving you that an example, it tells you a little bit about the image that the European Union wanted to project. I keep on saying European Union. Of course, at the time, it was not the European Union, right? But just for, it's easier if I keep on saying European Union, do not use the different terms that the EU had at the time. In the earlier years of this European Capitals of Culture program, and the focus was exclusively put on positive heritage. So they said cradle of democracy, Renaissance, etc. The willingness to include also negative elements, for example, concentration camps as heritage sites, only developed rather very slowly. It took really until the 1990s before this happened. And as you can imagine, the origin of this was on the national level. So if you zoom out a little bit and you see what's happening on the national level, also when it comes to the memory of the Holocaust and how this was dealt with, then you can clearly see that many countries only managed to start facing the question of responsibility and cooperation, collaboration, etc., in World War II crimes in the 1990s. In some countries, this happened a bit earlier, in others a little bit later. But overall, I think some sort of European consciousness only appeared in the 1990s, which is reflected then also on what's happening on the European Union level. And I will talk about this in a second. Now, the end of the Cold War exacerbated those developments further. And it was specifically the breaking open of the bipolar world that led to the eruptive return of memory and the reawakening of history in many ways. And this had to do with the fact that on the one hand, national myths, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, crumbled, which led to new questions of responsibility and guilt. But also in the West, of course, this development was very strong. And this had to do with the fact that, of course, different memory frames started to intersect. And this is probably one of the reasons why a new element came to the fore, and that was the Holocaust. Now, if I say that, you probably say, like, what, the Holocaust in the 1990s? I mean, this was a topic much earlier. But interestingly enough, when it comes to European integration, the Holocaust didn't play any role in early European integration. World War II, yes, the Holocaust not. You cannot say any traces of mentionings of the Holocaust in the early speeches and documents. And this is very similar to what happened also on the national level, where there was a protracted period of silence when it came to the Holocaust as such. Most countries, in terms of memory policies or commemorations, focused on issues of resistance, of victimhood, of martyrdom, of heroism, etc. Whereas, like the issue of the Holocaust as such was not addressed very much until, again, it varies a bit between the 70s, 80s until the 90s. Which means that, of course, the Holocaust as some sort of founding act for the European Union is really only plausible from an ex post perspective. And it has to be understood within a certain context, namely the attempt to create an overarching political identity which goes beyond the institutional framework of the EU by adding a bit of a transnational layer to national heritage, identities, and memories. The EU debate in this context obviously has to be seen in a transatlantic context as well, right? This is a debate that took place not only in Europe, but transatlantically, and the Holocaust very quickly became some sort of symbol. And I think there's this course on political symbols happening at the moment, so I think some of you are maybe following that. So there, you have it there, right? I mean, the Holocaust clearly became a symbol, and we can discuss maybe also later if this is a problem or not. The result was a flurry of activities that started in the 1990s on the institutional level with the aim to anchor the memory of the Holocaust firmly to the institutional setting of the EU. And you can see that by the European resolutions that were passed that were specifically addressing World War II and the murder of the European Jews. Quite a number of resolutions were passed in very few years. And the EP resolution 1995 then declared the 27th of January as the European-wide day to commemorate the Holocaust. Now, the 27th of January is on Monday. Depending on which country you're from, you probably see different variations of activities happening. In some countries, I've noticed there's a lot happening on the 27th. In other countries, if I ask, people actually have no idea what the 27th of January means. If you search in the Eurolex repository, which is the repository of the European Union containing all the legal documents, then you can see that the Holocaust has occupied more space in EU documents since 1990s than any other event in European history. And I think that is quite remarkable. It has become the yardstick with which many other political debates are being measured and evaluated, and it's often being referred to. If you pay attention to political discussions also on other wars, the Holocaust is always brought up, often as a it's instrumentalized often, or maybe I shouldn't say instrumentalized immediately, but it's often used for different aims, political aims, either to justify action or sometimes also inaction. The nation's ability or a nation's ability to face up to its national past has furthermore become a soft entrance criterion for joining the EU. You can see that in almost all discussions on enlargement. One of the topics that's always there is, how did the country deal with its past? And it's not an official criteria, it's not part of the acquis communautaire, but it is there. And you can see it in the Western Balkans, you can see in the discussions with Turkey, you could see it clearly in Central and Eastern Europe enlargement in 2004, 2007. Which is one of the reasons why it became one of the linchpins on the more recent debates on heritage and memory politics, because of those accessions that happened in 2004. So it's one of the, it really became one of the important topics. Checking the time. Okay, great. So from the very first sitting of the European Parliament, many of those newly admitted EU member states challenged the Western interpretation of World War II and the Holocaust. For them, of course, the end of the Second World War had meant the beginning of a new period of repression by the Soviet Union. It was not the end of the war in 1945, but it was really the beginning of a new moment of dictatorship. With the result that this new experiences of communist oppression superseded the memory of what had happened before. You can really clearly see those different layers of memories that are present there, and some of them are more prominent than others. As a result, the requirement to accept the EU-endorsed narrative that was developed in Western Europe almost exclusively as part of the accession process was perceived very much as some sort of imposition. At the same time, of course, all kinds of debates that are happening, political debates on the EU level, are always closely entangled to domestic discussions. There was this internal domestic struggle which was dealing with the legacy of the left and anti-communism. So you always have to keep that in mind as well when you look at the European level, that what's happening on, it's often a mirror of what's happening on the domestic level. MEPs from the new member states questioned the Western interpretation of history and used particularly the European Parliament as a platform to put forward an alternative memory narrative, according to which the experiences of suffering under Nazism and Stalinism are comparable and should, as such, receive equal recognition. I think I don't have to stress or I have to tell you what kind of effect this had on Western MEPs, right? For them, this came close to falsification of history. And was met with fierce resistance. There was very strong feeling that putting the crimes, for example, of Stalinism on the same level as the Holocaust would lead to a relativization of the Holocaust, to some sort of trivialization, etc. In the moment that representatives of several Central and Eastern European countries proposed to introduce a day of remembrance for the victims of communism in the European Remembrance Calendar, that was the moment when these differences between the Western narrative, which was already very consolidated, and the Eastern request for recognition of their experiences erupted in open parliamentary debate. If you already know when International Holocaust Day is, do you also know when this new date is? Just a day of remembrance for the victims of Stalinism. And yes, very good. Wow. Okay, this rarely ever happens. How do you know that? Aha. Yeah, that explains it. Because I think that's indeed, if you ask Western Europeans, usually they have no idea what happened. I mean, do you know what happened on the 23rd? I'm not asking you because you probably know. The 23rd of August. I help you with the year, 1939. Yeah. Yes, very good. Okay, I see what kind of audience I have here. Sorry? Oh, I should repeat it. Yeah, sorry, because there's people online who probably need to. So this is the day of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. Most people don't know this. Most Western Europeans don't know this, I should say, because in Central and Eastern Europe, this is much more prominent. And it had to do with the fact that, well, since this day was introduced, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but since this day was introduced in Central and Eastern Europe, this has become an important date. Things are being organized, activities are being organized, etc. It's connecting to an already existing tradition, because that date was already important before the fall of the Iron Curtain. In Western Europe as well, but it was only used by especially NGOs, etc., to draw attention to human rights violations that happened during the Soviet Union. So it was much less known. One of the images maybe that come to your mind, if you think about the 23rd of August, not 1939, of course, but shortly before the wall came down in 1989, was this long human chain that was stretching across the Baltic states. Don't know if you have seen pictures of that. But that happened also on the 23rd of August. So there's a reason for choosing that date. And there's also a reason why Eastern MEPs went for this date and not for the 9th of November, for example, which maybe a lot of Western Europeans would have preferred or would have chosen, because the 9th of November 1989 is associated with the fall of the Berlin Wall and therefore with the end of the Cold War. But it was a conscious decision to not go for this date because, again, it's a very Western date, but rather go with the 23rd of August, which is seen as the beginning of the division of Europe. Now, I didn't put anything in my lecture on this specific debate or how it came to being, but I think it is one of the, if you want to understand something about the struggles that are going on the European level, but also, of course, in between countries, then this is a really interesting debate to look at, because so many things come up there, right? It is on the one hand, these different narratives that I just highlighted, the Western one that developed over time, the Eastern one that came in very late and suddenly was clashing with this Western conception of history and what is important. You have the competition, you have, of course, the symbolic dimension, you have the question of power, of recognition, because very often that played a role as well, right? The Central and Eastern European states saw this very much as a recognition of their specific status as well. They wanted to be recognized as full members of the European Union. They wanted to have the history recognized, the heritage recognized. So this played a really important role. It was more than just some sort of parliamentary debate. At the same time, though, it also highlights, and I'm going to say something about the blind spots, which is obviously the memory of colonialism. I will say something about that later. But it shows also what is not being looked at, because everybody then started to focus on the question of Holocaust versus victims of Stalinism. But what about the experiences of the Southern European states? What about Spain, Portugal, Greece? What about the experience of oppression and dictatorship that those countries had until the 1970s? This is never being talked about. And also in this debate, it's being mentioned, but really only in a side sentence. So when they were discussing, okay, which victims are we actually going to commemorate here, they also included those victims. So it became an overarching totalitarianism framework, which many perceive as being wishy-washy. But it was the attempt to be more inclusive. Now we can discuss maybe if this is a problem or not, if this leads to homogenization or not, if the attempt to include everybody maybe also excludes others. But these are, I think, important questions that are being raised here. Generally speaking, I think if you do not only look at this specific debate, but more generally at memory clashes that you could observe, and I'm thinking also about the recent debates we've really had in the last years about Ukraine and the use of history in the Ukraine war. Now, of course, Israel, Gaza, the different political responses we've had in different countries there, which all come back to the role of memory, really, and history, and the relationship also that other countries had with it. I'm thinking particularly about Germany. Nobody really understood why Germany was reacting in the way it did react. But you have to see it in the context, of course, of again, of the Holocaust. If you look at this, it becomes clear that heritage issues and memory and remembrance continues to be used as political tools to underline differences, but also to legitimize action, sometimes also inaction. And it's very interesting to look at this. I mean, I'm fascinated by this, but this is obviously also my research field. But even if you're not so fascinated by it, if you start paying attention to this, when you're reading the news, you'll suddenly see how often there's references made to the past in one way or another. It's a really powerful tool here. And it's often also an expression of identity politics. I already mentioned that. It's identity, there's power questions related to it. And the EU, in this context, is a formidable additional forum to push forward claims that exist on a domestic level. So this impression of a tension and conflict-free European policy that could be suggested if you only look at the various heritage initiatives or at the resolutions of the European Parliament is certainly quite deceptive. This is only the surface level. That does not mean, however, that EU politics are ineffective because of the inherent impossibility to create a conflict-free policy. Indeed, if you look at the initiatives of the European Commission, for example, then you can see that debate and conflict are usually welcomed. And why is that? It seems a bit contradictory because the resolutions always seem to be like flattening everything and trying to find some sort of common ground. But the reason really is that memory and, debate and conflict are often seen to elements that are important for the formation of a European public sphere. If we don't have debate and conflict, if we don't have discussion, then probably the European public sphere also doesn't really exist. Now, if we look a bit closer at EU initiatives in this field, then I will only discuss one of them. I already mentioned some of the main heritage programs. European Capitals for Culture programs is the oldest one, and I'm almost sure that some of you might mention that at some point of time, so in your research. The newest one is the European Heritage Label that maybe some of you are familiar with. I've not prepared anything on that specifically, but we can go into this later as well. If we look at memory initiatives, then the most emblematic one is the Europe for Citizens program. It has changed name now. It's not called Europe for Citizens program anymore. It's called Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values program, CERF. I always forget what it stands for, actually. Europe for Citizens program was much more easy to remember. So the Europe for Citizens, which was the predecessor, was launched in December 2006 in the wake of the failed constitution. I don't know if you remember that, but there was the attempt to pass a constitution for Europe. There were 2 referenda organized in the Netherlands and in France, and in both cases, the people voted no. And then, yeah, the constitution was abolished. Of course, it still exists. The Lisbon Treaty is nothing but revamped constitution, but that's a different story. But of course, it was a bit of a crisis moment when this was rejected. Different, of course, from the 1970s with the oil crisis, but it was again a moment where, this whole raison d'être came back, and the question, okay, what do we want here? Do citizens actually follow us or not? That's one of the reasons why the Europe for Citizens program was initialized, with the idea that an open memory culture thrives only with citizens' engagement. So what the program was trying to do is to mobilize grassroots action by research institutes, by museums, by human rights organizations, and by civil society associations. Not only people dealing with memory, of course. Memory was only one element of this bigger program, which also dealt with town twinning initiatives, and generally speaking with citizens initiatives, really. What I find interesting with this is that the program is targeting a level that lies below the official state level. So whereas memory and history, heritage, etc., is usually associated with the state, and not necessarily with like civil society organizations, this suddenly was clearly targeting the level below. The idea was, I mentioned already before, to create a European public sphere, to help the development of a civil understanding of history, which allows for the active exchange between different memory cultures. Now, if we look at these ambitions and we look at the funding attached to it, you see something very typical happening, of course. There's very nice ideas, but there's not a lot of funding for it. So initially, it was only 4% of the overall financial envelope of the program, which was dedicated to memory. So the overall program was 290 million, which is also seems a lot, but it's very small if you look at the overall European Union budget. And now it's 20%. So that's, and the amount decreased the overall amount, but it's 20% that's dedicated to memory. Now, if you go back to what I told you in the beginning and the importance that policymakers attach to the past, memory, heritage issues, etc., then it is a little bit surprising that you have this huge discrepancy between aims and financial means. But I think this is probably a story that you know, because it's the same really also in the heritage sector, also on the national level. Yeah, I've talked for like half an hour now, so I think I'll start wrapping up. And then we have enough time also for discussion, yeah? So we'll not wrap up immediately, but like another 5-10 minutes, then I have 40 minutes, if that's okay. So I think like we can say, like, if we put it all together, what I just said is that heritage and memory issues have played an important role since the inception of the European Union. And in a sense, especially the more recent EU policies seem to adhere to the considerations of scholars who have postulated the idea that there's no such thing as collective memory based on a common history and heritage, but that there can very well be collective conditions for memories. If you look at the Commission initiatives, that's very much the idea, I think, to create conditions that allow for this memory exchange. So it's not necessarily the idea of like creating some sort of European memory. I think that is just impossible. And it doesn't also seem to be the aim of the European Commission to do this. It rather tries to create a democratic culture of discussion and also maybe dissent in some instances. The reason for this are obviously quite deep lying. Memory and identity conflicts are seen as damaging for the European integration project. And if you look at the importance of remembering the past, or how it is linked and also to other issues, then you can see that especially in the more recent resolutions, and I'm thinking about the 1917 resolution, which was debated a lot in Italy, interestingly enough, not so much in other countries, but it was one of the resolutions that really made the headlines in Italian news. Is that the past started to be linked very closely to current threats to democracy. So not anymore just to the basic values of the European Union and the founding myth and where the EU comes from, but very clearly also to the future, and yeah, the future of democracy really on this continent. The 2019 EP resolution is special in that sense because it drew on a large body of support, and it's clearly addressing the future generations. So on the one hand, worries are expressed when it comes to the current state of democracy and the rise of the extreme right, for example. It was formulated in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, and of course the position of Russia, and then of the rise of the extreme right. I mean, we're in a country where we have an extreme right government at the moment, and that is happening almost everywhere in Europe with the elections in different countries. So it's maybe not so surprising that this is linked, but it really deviates from the previous resolutions and also previous policies, which were always addressing history, memory, heritage as some sort of value-based discourse. Whereas like now, I mean, this is still connected to values, but also very clearly with this potential threat in mind. Generally speaking, I think the way in which EU tries to connect the past, the present, and the future says a lot about the self-image that it wants to convey, and also the vision it wishes to foster among its citizens. It's equally telling, though, what is being overlooked, and I already mentioned it, and this is the memory of colonialism. The EU remains curiously quiet when it comes to colonialism and imperialism, despite the fact that this memory or this heritage is very closely connected to the European integration process itself. I don't think I have to say very much about this, but part of it is already the fact that the Schuman Declaration is talking about developing the African continent as one of the aims, because quite a number of member states were colonial powers at the time and had colonial possessions. And not many people realize that, of course, when countries were joining, like Portugal, for example, who had colonial possessions, they made sure that those also connections, economical and political connections, were brought into the European Union. So it is very closely linked and interlinked. And it is, if you think about this, there surprising that there's this silence. Especially if we think about how outspoken the EU was when it came to other genocides, other experiences of dictatorship, etc. When it comes to colonialism, the EU has really not done very much in terms of symbolic and factual atonement. And it probably has to do with the fact that it concentrated its efforts almost exclusively for decades on the experience of Nazism, Stalinism, National Socialism, and fascism. And this memory probably overshadowed everything else that happened, where Europeans were clearly only perpetrators and nothing else. I think it's probably one of the things that we'll have to, or we can continue to observe. It's going to be very interesting to see how the EU is going to deal with this new challenge in the future. They kind of navigated the challenge of the conflictual past between East and West. This is not that much of an issue anymore, especially if you look at the more recent debates. It comes up I've just finished research on the role of memory in foreign policy decisions, for example. I looked particularly at the Ukraine war, and I found it very telling that the differences between East and West that you might have seen in the past were not there anymore very much, even though we were dealing, of course, with a situation that was at the border to Central and Eastern European member states. But the big question really is how it's going to deal with this new issue, or rather old issue, let's put it, of colonialism. And that's definitely something to keep an eye on in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aline, for this wonderful keynote lecture. If I may start the question, since I got the microphone first, I would like to ask more of a question on your conclusion, or probably to ask you more to elaborate more on this idea of blind spots and colonialism. I find it very interesting to see this idea of divided memory that you mentioned. And then I would like to know how this memory of colonialism, or probably memories in the plural of colonialism, have been overlooked by the whole EU integration process in the idea of the nation building itself from a national, but also at more of European perspective. Not only how it was overlooked, but also how this, or to what extent it was dividing between not just the Eastern Europe and the Western Europe, but also the Northern and the Southern Europe.
Yeah, I think like one of the interesting things when it comes to the whole debate is, I mean, you kind of ask two questions, right? How is it possible it was overlooked? And then what does it do within Europe, in the European construct? Are there maybe divisions within Europe there as well? Yeah, I think it was overlooked for, I mean, there are many different reasons probably. One of them I mentioned already, the fact that there was so much focus on these other pasts that it drew attention away from it. At the same time, we've seen when it comes to the memory of National Socialism, fascism, Stalinism, etc., the EU only managed to do something once a certain process had started on the domestic level. So I suspect somehow that the domestic level needs to move first. And if you think about the memory of colonialism, we all know that on the domestic level, nothing is happening there either, or very little. I mean, it's very recent now that these debates are starting, that apologies are being given, that there's talk about potential restitutions of heritage. For example, there's connections between museums now. There's now new films that are being produced. So it's slowly starting to, some sort of consciousness is being developed, yeah, political steps are being taken. And I suspect somehow that something will only move on the European level once this process has properly started on a national level. This doesn't mean that there's nothing happening on the EU level, right? I mean, I exaggerated a little bit there, but it is very little that has happened. And it's also not very obvious. I think if I asked you, you probably cannot come up with one initiative by the EU when it comes to the memory of colonialism. There's sometimes debates about a monument that should be erected in Brussels, etc. Then additional commemoration days. But yeah, it's very small steps. Now, the second question, might this have to do also with the fact that there's a division within Europe also when it comes to this memory? And yeah, clearly there is. And there's again a division between East and West. So many Central and Eastern European states feel that as part of a memory that it's not theirs because they didn't have any colonial possessions. They were not colonizers. This is not part of their history. So they have nothing to do with it. On the contrary, their own narrative is like, well, we were colonized. So we were the oppressed. So if we take a colonization, this brings me to another point, which is like the very difficulty of the term because it's being used in many different ways. Yeah, they feel that they don't have anything to do with this. And to a certain extent, that is also true for Northern European countries, or like within Europe. I mean, there's several countries that never had colonial possessions or very little, and they somehow felt, okay, this is not part of our history, so we don't really have to deal with it. Why should we do something on the European level if this is this is not ours? Which is obviously only partially true, because the whole of Europe, and I'm not talking about the European Union, but really the whole of Europe benefited from colonialism, participated in the endeavor in one way or another. People did travel over there, even though they did not have maybe the country itself didn't have a colonial possession, etc. So the connections and links were all over the place, and saying we didn't have anything to do with it only because my country didn't have direct colonial ties. It's of course a little bit an easy way out.
Oh, so many questions, but I'm going to try to just stick to one right now. Towards the end, you mentioned that there are people that speak about the fact that there can be only collective conditions for memories, but no European collective memory. And I found this concept of collective conditions particularly intriguing, especially myself coming from a country and also doing research on a country in which within that country itself, South Africa, there are multiple contending narratives about specific heritage objects, narratives, and the like, and how then to find collective conditions. So what are these examples of such collective conditions, and how do we find them?
Yeah, so I mean, what is meant by this is that you cannot unify memories because most narratives are just too different. I mean, you just mentioned your own research, but also where you're coming from. And it would automatically lead to some sort of homogenization and exclusion if there was the attempt made to come up with one narrative that fits all, which simply doesn't exist, can't be. So the collective conditions, what is meant with this is that conditions can be created that allow for the exchange of those memories. So to create, for example, forums where people can express their memories, can exchange their experiences, their interpretations of events, etc. And like one example is, for example, the attempt also to create common textbooks, because I think with textbooks you see it most obviously on an official level where the different narratives are being set in stone, they're being transmitted to the next generation, and if you give the same textbook that is dealing with one event to someone from another country, they will probably not necessarily recognize everything that's being written in there. So the idea like writing a common textbook would be one example of like this, creating a condition that allows people to exchange their different views on a specific event. Because that's what memory is, right? In the end, it's the interpretation of a historical event.
I have another question again on the same idea of blind spots and silences. It's quite obvious that I'm really interested in this idea of absences, silences, not just as an outcome, but also silencing as an active process. And I'm very interested in how we are linking both political science to memory studies, and more precisely linking how memory and remembering is part of the political sphere, is part of the public sphere, by this idea of the development of European memory policies since the 70s, with a more focus on the 80s and the 90s, as you explained in the lecture. And here I would like to ask you the question from the other side. Can we also consider that forgetting and silences are not just the outcome of the selective memory, as you explained, but also is part of an active process in decision-making process? To make it a bit clear, is that, can we say that following Michel Ralph-Trouillot, the idea of silencing the past, in this idea of rethinking the unthinkable, specifically in relation to the memories of colonialism, that there is an active process of putting this silence and forgetting in public policy. And consequently, the idea of overlooking or silences or amnesia, as you explain in your work, is not just the outcome, but it's also part of making these policies. And I'm asking this question while having in mind two main examples. For instance, how the French nation-building state is actually dealing with colonialism in Algeria, or even in the same line of memory policies, Loi Taubira law in 2001, which actually said that it's the transatlantic slave trade is a crime against humanity in 2001, while a few years later, there is a French law stating that we need to talk more about the positive side of colonialism in school. So can we eventually say that this is part of a public policy and not just the outcome of a public policy on selective memories?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think like a lot of this is not just, I mean, it seems as if it's just happens, right? A selective process, that's how you called it. But now I think like a lot of it is directed as well. It's a conscious choice to remember one thing and not something else. Not on the community level necessarily, because I think there you have a multiplicity of memories that are always present. But what is then actually taken up on the national level, the conscious choice is being made. And I think especially in the case of colonialism, that's particularly problematic, right? Because these discussions have come up in the context of other policies. I'm just thinking about migration debates, etc. Right? I mean, these are so clearly linked. They're so sensitive, and then decisions are being taken to not commemorate, to silence, to not discuss it because the repercussions probably would be so big that it would question, I think, a lot of other things as well. And that's usually when a conscious decision is being taken to just silence this memory or to not discuss it, to leave it up to the victim groups, for example, to bring this up, etc. And yeah, you gave the example of France. Their discussion is probably much older than in many other countries for obvious reasons. But if you follow it, you can clearly see the ups and downs, also depending on the changes and which political parties in power, right? Who's fostering a certain narrative and who's not. Memory is very powerful. It's a very powerful tool. I said that before, because it has all these, these connections also to other decisions that are being taken in the policy field.
So the title of your presentation today is "The Past as Stepping Stone for the Future," and some scholars also talk about futures, small f and capital, I beg your pardon, plural. I wonder, just in terms of what you also just said now, in what ways can the acknowledgement and commemoration of or seeking for atonement, I think you used that word earlier, of Europe's colonial history contribute to maybe more just, equitable futures or international relations in the near future, in futures to come, particularly with former colonies in mind?
Oh, yeah, this is a very big question. And I think there's also, again, there's two levels to it that you kind of touched upon, right? On the one hand, it's equality within nations. And I think like we're really talking on the nation state level as well. And then you have to bring up issues of equality or racism, living together, migration, etc. That all is linked to it. And addressing those past crimes, I think, are fundamental to understand those relationships and connections that exist on the nation state level. And I'm just thinking, I mean, we're in the Royal Dutch Institute here, but like there's this ongoing discussion about Zwarte Piet. And I'm pretty sure that most Dutch people are very sick and tired of hearing about this. But I think this is an important discussion because it's a good example really of like where these lingering colonial thought translates into things that are often perceived as a tradition, but can be very, being perceived as being very damaging and problematic for people that are living in Dutch society, who, for example, have a darker skin, right? And just to give an example, and that it's almost impossible to discuss this openly, because then questions of heritage clash with bigger issues of inequality and racism, makes this whole very complicated, I find. So it is, I think it is, what I'm trying to say is it is important to discuss it and to bring it all to the table and say, okay, this is how it's being perceived. Maybe for many Dutch people, this is a tradition and a heritage, and they don't want this to be touched. But then for other people, this is an insult. So it is important that all of this is being heard and it's being discussed in the public. And then maybe other solutions can be found that doesn't touch the heritage, but allows people to not feel offended. And some municipalities have already come up with solutions there. The other element is the international relations element, and especially relations with the previous colonial powers with the colonized countries. And there, what we can see is that still in international relations, we can see a disbalance, right? It's not always an equal relationship. You can see also there, I think, colonial power structures continue. And there, I think I would say equally that having an open discussion and more awareness, knowing each other's histories, for example, can contribute markedly to breaking up those boundaries that still exist, and those relationships that continue to be unequal.
I can ask probably a final question for myself. I'm not going to ask any questions about silences, but I'll ask more a question on the idea of shared and common that you explained in your presentation, but also that's already part of your research, this idea of the common heritage and the shared heritage. And I think that it's quite interesting probably to draw some parallels with other contexts. In your presentation, you focused more on how focusing and how crafting narratives based on this idea of shared and common heritage and memories as well. It was actually part of the building of a regional project, which is the European Union. And I think that this vocabulary or this adjective of shared was also used by post-colonial societies. I have in mind the example of Egypt in the 60s, for instance, and how the Pan-Arabists and anti-colonial leader Nasser used this particular language in the UNESCO when he talked more about human heritage to safeguard artifacts, Nubian artifacts in Egypt. But also this particular vocabulary exists not in the 60s as in post-colonial societies, but more in the 90s with Western societies toward former colonies. And I have the examples of the Netherlands, for instance, when it comes to heritage diplomacy and how this vocabulary of common and shared history and common and shared heritage with these former colonies. So my question now, because there are a lot of debates on whether this is depoliticizing or not depoliticizing, to what extent this discourse is important, because it brings to the table a very important silenced or absent debates, while from the other side it's actually concealing unbalanced power dynamics and domination. To what extent this can also might be seen as performative, specifically based on the cultural capitals you explained, but also on the citizen program.
Yeah, performative. That's a very good word, because I think a lot of this is seen as, I used symbolic a lot, I think, but there's also a performance element to it. And I think especially like if you look at, you gave the example of cultural, no, how did you call it? Heritage diplomacy, right? But I think also the apologies that we saw in the last years, right? A lot of them are very performative. You get to see that. And then you start wondering, is that really meant, or was it maybe external pressure? Now everybody has to do this. Politicians, like one started and then other countries have to follow, etc. These in Germany would say Sonntagsreden, right? I mean, like Sunday speeches that are given on a Sunday, but they don't really mean anything. I think there's clearly elements of that as well. What I think is important is to see if policies follow, right? Is this just talks and symbolic gestures? I still believe that symbolic gestures are important. They're not just something that stand there. They often are the starting point of something else. So I think that's why they actually are important. But the real importance, you can see that only if policies follow, and what kind of policies are there, right? I think in the case of colonialism, a lot of it is complicated because if, for example, restitution was paid to everybody who suffered, then it would just be impossible. I mean, financially, it would just be impossible. So we're talking about something that is also not realistic. But I think there's other things that can be done that show that this is the apology that was issued is not just something that a politician just did because everybody is making apologies at the moment.
So to wrap up this part, I'm just going to ask a short one. In your presentation, you talked about an open memory culture. Can you define that for us, please?
Okay. You asked me short question. Yeah. So what I meant with it, I think I've kind of already said this a little bit earlier. Is an open memory culture. What I mean by that is a culture that allows voicing different narratives, that allows voicing different memories as well, where they can get into contact with each other, in conversation with each other, etc. That doesn't mean that anything can be said. I think that's, we look at the recent discussions about freedom of speech, etc., social media, what we've just seen happening in the US. I don't mean with open memory culture, like anything goes and everything is acceptable and any memory is, that's not what it is, but it means that the acknowledgement that there are different interpretations of the past and that there should be the possibility of getting them into contact with each other.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all three of you. And just a little round of introduction. Mayada Madbouli here to your, what is it, left? And this is Sinead Barnabas, who are the organizers of the colloquium that will take place on the next 2 days here at the Institute. And I am very sure that there are more questions for Dr. Sierp here from the audience or maybe online. So raise your hand if Aurora already has her hand up in the Zoom. And I don't know if you can open up your microphone, Aurora, and then we can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much, Professor, for this lecture. This was really interesting. I was really struck by what you said on the role of memory in foreign policy positions, because that's what I'm writing my PhD on. And I think one of the things that I'm really struggling in my research is defining heritage, because the European Union seems to have defined heritage so closely to certain values and to human rights. So in my archive research, I'm really struggling to see what is heritage policy and what is not heritage policy. So I was wondering if you have some tips for how to navigate that in my archive research. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Aurora. Very interesting that you're doing research in this, which is like really my new research field now, if you so want, the role of memory in foreign policy decisions. What is heritage? I think, to be honest, you should come to the workshop and attend this for the next 2 days, because I think this is really one of the topics that you're going to address, right? And I suspect from just talking to some of you earlier a little bit, there's probably not one definition of it anyway, right? So it depends very much on the disciplinary background that you have. And to be honest, I'm not sure if the European Union has its own definition of heritage. And that's probably why you're struggling with it so much.
Yeah, exactly.
There's probably also the bigger question of like the difference between memory and heritage. Then you can also put in history, memory, and heritage if you so want. This is an ongoing discussion also among academics. And if you're writing a PhD, I think what I would do is you have to find your own definition. So you say these are the different things that I find in the literature, etc. Or if you look at the European Union, this is the way they have defined this in this context, and this is the definition that I'm going to continue using from now on. I think that would probably be my way of addressing this issue.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Beautiful advice. Thank you. So here in the room, of course, we have questions, and that is the ghost of the Institute. That means that it's 1818 right now, because that means that it goes down. So please allow me to go and close that again by asking a question.
Shall I? Because otherwise you won't see me. So I'll be standing only for that. So thank you so much for the interesting lecture. I've been following your research, which is very useful for guiding us through foreign policy, heritage and memory and everything. I'd like to go back to the soft conditionality aspect that you mentioned before. Well, my focus is on the Western Balkans in this case, but I think this has been something into play for all neighboring countries who've been on the path to access the EU. Well, my question would be, what are the realistic expectations of the EU in this regard, and also the actual impacts that have been reaped? Because bottom line consideration is that it took 45 years, more or less, to the EU to actually start confronting the Holocaust, World War II. Some external factors you mentioned came into play, but also some internal ones, because there is also a matter of generational change, whereby the direct witnesses won't be there anymore, but also the direct implicated subjects won't be there anymore. So my fear, on the one hand, is of a facade memory work in countries where those implicated subjects and those direct witnesses are still mostly there and often in political life still. Well, yeah, sorry.
No, absolutely. I think you're really putting your finger on an open wound there to a certain extent. And you're talking about expectations, rightly so, right? Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I think like impact, that's always difficult to measure, especially because it is not officially part of the acquis communautaire, but it's always there, right? It's always there in the background. It's one of the reasons why, for example, Turkey has not been moving at all in the last, when did they sign the association agreement in the 1960s, I think. Like a lot of people say it's because of religion, etc. But like one of the real reasons is that Turkey has refused so far to recognize the Armenian genocide. And that is really one of the big, among other things. I mean, like they are really, you can look at the acquis and you say out of the 20 chapters, I think they've only opened 13 and they've closed. I don't know the numbers, but like it's really just also just maths of saying like which parts have been addressed and which haven't. But the whole issue of memory and dealing with the past in a certain way is certainly one of the issues there. And the Western Balkans indeed is the other big case. Where the history is so recent, and there's still people in power that you have these power structures that are still there, that it's probably, I think you're right in saying it's almost unrealistic to accept or expect something from those countries if the EU itself has taken so long to address issues of collaboration and cooperation, etc. I don't really have an answer. I think you're very right in raising this, that this is an issue. it is very interesting to see how this nevertheless runs like a red thread through almost all enlargement debates, that it's there in the background as like one of the issues that have to be addressed in one way or another, and it's seen as a problem if they haven't.
May I pass the microphone? Yes.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. This was super, super interesting. And I've learned quite a lot. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit better what integration means. This idea of European integration, because when we learn about, and I'm not from Europe, so when we learn about the history of Europe, we learn of how each country was so different and they all fought amongst each other, and there was a lot of division for a long time, and there's still a lot of internal division in a lot of countries. And so I would love to understand, how does heritage, memory, and integration associate to each other, and what do we mean here by integration? And so thank you so much.
You're asking these big questions, these definition questions. That's yeah, I mean, like, of course, I mean, on the one hand, you have the technical term, right? European integration as like the coming together of countries agreeing to harmonize some of their policies. I don't know if this is a good definition. Thomas, can you help me? Here next to you, the European integration scholar. But yeah, so that I think this is a very technical side of it, right? Of harmonizing some of the policies, of creating common institutions that, depending on the competences they have, pass laws that then have to be followed in all countries. Oof, I don't know if I maybe should define this properly in like 3 sentences. And then, I mean, you have probably also like a more philosophical element to it, which is maybe not all directly connected to the competences of the EU or the kind of laws that are passed from above, but rather this bigger question of like what keeps people together, right? I mean, we kind of discussed this a little bit earlier. What is the glue that holds together the European Union? And that this cannot just be laws that are being passed from above, and that cannot be just the fact that you can cross from one border to the next without showing your passport. I think it's quite obvious that there has to be more to it than this. This at least idea of Europe, right? The idea of some sort of commonality of things that are shared. And it is true that I think most of the heritage discourse is, or most of this identity discourse is very value-based. Like, okay, if there's one thing that holds us together, then it is a certain set of values that everybody agrees should be defended. And in the recent years, this has become more and more into question. That's the reason why there was so much debate about Hungary and Poland still being part of the EU or not, because this was always justified with the values discourse, saying like, well, maybe we are not really on the same page here anymore. Interestingly enough, sorry that I keep on going back to my recent research, but of course this is the one that I'm focusing on a lot now. This discussions around the Ukraine war, and I looked at 2014, the invasion of the annexation of Crimea, and then the invasion in 2022. This came back over and over again, like the values, right? It's like this was an attack on our values. That's how it was perceived. The Russian attack on Ukraine was attacking a member of the European family, and our values are being attacked, so we have to defend them. This is very strong, and it was a discourse that you probably followed on the national level, but it was very strong also on the European level. So I think this despite everything, this is probably still where the glue is to a certain extent, even though it's being put into question, and especially also with the rise of the extreme right. I mean, there's lots of questions here, there, but I think if you boil it down to it, this is probably one of the things that people would mention as being the binding element.
We have Thank you so much. I'm afraid I do see some more eyes that want to ask a question, but I'm afraid we have to stop right here and thank Aline, but also the two interlocutors who asked the first questions. Thank you to the audience, and please join us in having a drink, and please sign the register that we put on the table, as we are a very large and amazing crowd. So please join me in thanking all three of you, especially Aline, and until next time.